Welcome to Spotlight. Today we're going to be talking about something that we don't talk about very often, but unfortunately I think we're missing an awful lot of information by not doing so. We're going to talk about antiquity and modern science and how they came together. My guest today is Dr. Julie Hruby, the assistant professor of classics at Dartmouth College. And we're going to be talking about what Dr. Hruby is doing in terms of investigating the past and using the tools of the present. Julie, welcome.
Thank you.
First of all, who is Julie Hruby?
That's a hard question to answer. I don't actually have a vast amount of personal life. I love my work and I spend a lot of time on it. I do have a partner, Eric, who works here at Okemo Valley TV. And we live in the village of Hartford, in the town of Hartford, Vermont.
Okay.
And so, yeah, that's about it.
Okay, now, what about your academic background?
So I did a PhD in Aegean prehistory at the University of Cincinnati. It's a particularly good program for that. They excavated a bunch of sites that everybody's heard of, like Troy and Pylos, and a whole lot of other sites besides. And since then, I've had a bunch of other kinds of training. While I was there, I got a little bit of training in fingerprint classification from the FBI. And this last winter, I actually attended the National Latent Print Examiners Training Academy. And that, I think, makes me the only person ever to have both a PhD in archaeology and to be a competent latent print examiner.
Well, good heavens. Now, you've got your PhD in an area that I love, in the antiquities and the classics. I believe you were specializing in the Greek side of it. My background's in the other side.
Okay, fair.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I actually started doing Roman and then switched over, so I appreciate Roman too.
Okay, but the thing that fascinates me about your background is you obviously have all of the classical background, but going into fingerprinting, and this wasn't fingerprinting of the Greek antiquities. You weren't trying to get Aristotle's fingerprint.
No.
Or maybe you were, but
no.
But it's a very unusual endeavor, and I think one of the things that's going to be very interesting in this discussion is how you're actually using it.
Okay, well, so in the past, other archaeologists have in fact looked at fingerprints and have tried to match them in order to understand people in antiquity. Or I should probably say that they have brought in forensic scientists who have matched fingerprints for them in order to try to understand what kinds of patterns there were about who was doing what.
Well, excuse me, but what can you tell from a fingerprint?
So that's one of the things you can tell is who made a thing and did the same person make multiple things, as long as you have the same finger. So the challenge with fingerprint matching is that no two fingers of any one person match each other. So you could have a body of ancient material with 10 fingerprints and not actually know how many people you have. So that's a challenge. And also, we don't always get very good preservation of prints from antiquity. Sometimes you only get a little piece of a fingerprint. And traditionally, you haven't been able to do anything with those. So my suspicion that is starting to bear fruit is that there are other kinds of questions you can ask. And so one of the questions I'd like to ask is whether fingerprints came from men or women. And one of the questions that I am trying to ask is what age of person might have produced a fingerprint?
Can you tell the sex of a person from the fingerprint?
Well, you can't, there's no dead giveaway where there's a single thing you can look at and it'll tell you this was definitely a male or this was definitely a female. But there are a series of different factors that correlate with being male or with being female to different extents. And people in the past have realized that there are differences in size between men's prints and women's prints. On average, men have bigger, broader ridges in their fingerprints. But there are a lot of reasons that doesn't actually work very well in practice. And one of the reasons that it doesn't work very well in practice is that it makes it really difficult to know what's the difference between an adult woman and a teenage boy. Because they have comparable breadths of ridges. So we're starting to look at other kinds of factors. So for instance, if you sort of envision a fingerprint being cut through the middle, there are ridges and there are furrows. And on average, it looks like women have broader ridges and narrower furrows. And on average, men have narrower ridges and broader furrows. So that's the kind of factor that we're trying to sort of statistically crunch a bunch of these sorts of things together to sort out what was made by men and what by women.
Well, now, what are the materials that you're looking at to actually get these prints? I mean, you mentioned that given the time lapse, I imagine fingerprints sort of disappear.
So fingerprints that are in amino acids, the kind of things that usually forensic scientists would look at, are completely gone. And so mostly I'm looking at ceramics. Fingerprints are also preserved in other things that can harden after they were made. So for instance, plaster will have a fingerprint in it. And as long as nobody else touches it before it dries or it doesn't get wiped away, that plaster fingerprint will actually still be there 3,000, 4,000 years later. But mostly I'm working on ceramics. So if a potter or a sculptor working in clay or a scribe who's writing on a clay tablet leaves behind a fingerprint, and then that object is fired afterwards, then that fingerprint becomes more or less permanent and will still be there 3,000, 4,000 years later for us to find.
Now, in terms of time, how far back are we going in terms of the Greek experience?
So the earliest material I've worked on comes from the middle of the 6th millennium BC, so the Neolithic period. There are lots and lots of figurines in Greece from the Neolithic, and many of them, it turns out, have fingerprints on them. Whether the preservation is good enough that we're going to get the data we need, I don't know yet, but I hope so. So we will see.
Okay, now we've been talking about the ceramics, etc. Now, recently, hasn't there been some interest in the actual food that they were eating and the menus and things of that nature? Have you worked in that area?
So that is another thing I've done with myself. So before I came to Dartmouth, I taught at Berea College in rural Kentucky, and I was in an art department there, and it was wonderful, partly because we had students who were both ceramics majors and art history majors, and I was teaching art history. And so I could work with students who were really knowledgeable about how to make pottery. And so we did some replication studies. We had some different types of Mycenaean cooking pots that we wanted to know how they were used. And I had a running debate with a colleague of mine about how a couple different types of pots were made. And so one of my students, Connie Podleski, and I made up some replicas and we tested them out. And we discovered that probably unsurprisingly, the Mycenaeans were eating souvlaki, little skewers with meat probably on them. And there are these griddles that are sort of round and have little semi-perforations through the bottom. And there was a question about whether those went perforation side up or perforation side down. And we figured out that they probably went perforation side up.
Good heavens, this sounds fascinating. Just as an aside, and I know this is not antiquity, but I couldn't help but think when you were talking about a fingerprint being permanently established so it could be recorded, or it could be used hundreds of years thereafter. What about Renaissance paintings? Is that becoming a subject, a means now to verify that, yes, this was Rembrandt or wasn't Rembrandt?
Well, that's a little embarrassing, actually. There is a man whose name I don't remember who claimed that he could use fingerprint analysis to establish the identities of painters. And unfortunately, he knew nothing at all about fingerprint analysis and was entirely making it up.
Okay.
So in theory, it should be possible, but...
Okay, well, I know we're getting off this topic, but it just popped into my head that if you have oil on a canvas, it's very likely that there's a fingerprint. But now...
You do also get fingerprints in lost wax cast bronze.
Now you are working now with modern Greek potters.
Yes.
How is that being, how are you working with them, and then how are you relating it to the past?
So we don't really know which ancient potters were male and which were female, with a very, very few exceptions. There are a few classical potters who actually signed their work, and all or all but one of them were men. So what we really need is to be able to tell the difference between men's prints and women's prints. And the closest population we're going to get to ancient Greek potters is actually modern Greek potters. And so they're going to be close in terms of, as close as we're going to get in terms of their genetics, but also in terms of their profession. And what you do with your hands has a certain amount of impact on some of the attributes of your fingerprints. So you won't actually change your fingerprint pattern over the course of your life unless you scar your hands or something like that. But some of the more measurement kinds of data will change depending on what you do. Bricklayers, for instance, end up having very little fingerprint visible because they're working with very rough objects, and it wears...
The brick eroded the actual print.
Yeah.
I had never thought of that, but that's...
So we wanted...
I guess that's why all these years I've never been a bricklayer.
Perhaps. But one of the other things that may have some impact on some of the attributes of a fingerprint is how muscular the hands are. And so one of the best ways to make that a complete, not a factor at all, is simply to go with people whose hand musculature is going to match those of ancient potters. So modern potters are going to be doing very similar kinds of tasks, and so we'll have similar levels of musculature.
Okay, now, does this, from what you're saying, it implies that the fingerprint itself has not evolved or changed dramatically over the period of time that you're talking?
It doesn't seem to have. In fact, there are other primates that have fingerprints that are not radically different from human ones. So the dimensions are a little different, but overall, the concept of fingerprints is, at this point, I don't know how many millions of years old.
That's true. I don't even know when somebody first, thought about this as an identification device, but I believe that was what it was first used for, wasn't it?
That is one of the things it was first used for, yes.
Okay. What else was it used for?
Well, in some cases, it looks like people were using it less as an identification device and more as a way to make a pattern. So we have ancient pottery that has decoration that looks like a rope, and they were actually just using the side of the thumb or the tip of the thumb to impress into this band of clay. And so it was completely for decorative purposes, not identification at all.
Yeah, this is fascinating. Now, in doing this, I understand that you are using a very, very high-tech 3D scanner. Can you tell us a little bit about that device?
Sure. So it is made by Cans, and it is very high resolution. It was not cheap. And
Well,
so I was fortunate that it became available to me about the time that I was going back to this project. So I originally thought about it in sort of the mid-1990s, but there wasn't this kind of technology at the time. And so I've recently come back to the project, and just a couple of years ago, this high-resolution 3D scanner was put on the market, and it will hit resolutions that are slightly less good than the company claims, but are nonetheless actually much better than what I actually need. So, for instance, in terms of the z-axis, the up-down axis, it will be possible to repeat measurements at accuracy levels or precision levels, I guess, of a micron. So that's a pretty high resolution scan.
well, that would be very impressive. I mean, for someone who has trouble remembering how many centimeters are in an inch.
2.54 as it happens.
But at any rate, you are taking fingerprints from these. I call them young potters. I guess, given the age period we're talking about, they are young. But the modern Greek potters.
So modern Greek
and
potters.
What do you do with that to relate it to the past?
So I am turning those over to a couple of computational scientists. Dan Rockmore at Dartmouth is working with me on this. And he runs the Newcomb Institute for Computational Science, which is one of our funders. And we've actually been funded by a whole lot of other people, the Mellon Foundation, the Dickey Center, the Leslie Center, et cetera. And so he's taking all of this three-dimensional data that I'm exporting in, and the scanner has its own proprietary format. So I'm exporting it into CSV files, which are basically like Excel files with a grid of data that shows how high or low any given print is on a grid system. And so he is going to do statistical analysis to evaluate which ones, and to predict which ones come from men and which ones come from women, using the modern sample as our reference sample. So if, for instance, the ratio of the width of a ridge to the width of a furrow is different between men and women in modern Greek potters, then our expectation is that that would also be true for ancient ones.
Okay. Now, how long does it take you just to, I assume you're looking at a fingerprint at a time.
One at a time.
Okay, and how long does it take you to analyze a fingerprint?
Well, it depends what you mean analyze. So,
Well, you said you were preparing the grid for this computational colleague.
yes.
So you could prepare that information for that.
There are a whole lot of steps. So the first thing that I do is I actually scan the print, and how long that takes depends on how big the print is. So for instance, a palm print is a pretty big amount of area, right? You've got a lot, versus, the tip of a pinky is a much smaller amount of area. And so if I were scanning a print from the tip of a pinky, I would scan at 2 different resolutions. I would scan it 25 times, which would give me the entire area of the print. And then I would scan it 80 times because with the higher resolution scans, I can't get as much area, but I can get a much more detailed view of the topography of the print. And so if I were just scanning the tip of a pinky print, it might only take me, say, 2 minutes to do the scanning. And then I actually have this fairly complicated process for exporting the material where I export it, I crop it, I export it again, I normalize it, I export it again, I flatten it, and I export it again. So all of that probably would take, I'm going to say, 15 minutes for a very small scan. And if I'm scanning something big, like a palm print, the initial scan might take me 25, 30 minutes, followed by maybe another 15 minutes.
Now, are there differences between a palm print, just as there are differences with the fingerprint?
There are. So people who've worked with modern populations have found that things like the kinds of ratios that you get between different parts of the palm print will vary from population to population, and we don't know yet, but we expect that some of the things that we find in fingerprints will also hold true in palm prints. So if in a fingerprint, the ratio between ridge width and valley width is in some way correlated with sex, we will be surprised if the same is not true for the palms. But there are other things about the palms that are a little bit different. So for instance, there are these things that we politely call white lines.
White lines?
White lines.
Okay.
Less politely, they're wrinkles. So they are a thing that correlates with both sex and age. So women tend to have far more of them than men do, and older people tend to have far more of them than younger people do. And so I had a ton of them even when I was 23, when I took my first fingerprint analysis class. But you end up with many, many more of them on certain regions of the palm than you do on your fingers. Well,
good heavens, all these years I just thought that was a hand, and now it's become... Now, you're working with a team in this whole process. You've already referred to the computational fellow. Now, who else is involved?
Well, I have an assistant who is Greek and American. She grew up near Athens until she was 12. Her name is Depi Karalis. And she became a Dartmouth student, and that's how I found her. One of my colleagues who teaches modern Greek, Irene Kikandis, knows all of the Greek students and recommended her to me. And she's fantastic. She was not an archaeology major or a classics major. She actually majored in biology and women's studies. But it means that she's absolutely perfect for the project and fascinated in the ways in which people's physical bodies and gender identities and things like that interact.
My heavens. Now, in terms of what does all this add up to in terms of what's the historical impact of this?
Well, it depends. So I'm actually asking a bunch of different, very specific questions about antiquity. So one of them is with these Neolithic figurines, some of them are called steatopagus, and it basically refers to images of women who have who are well endowed in some cases and often have big hips. And there's been a long-standing debate since 1861 about what they were used for. And there are different hypotheses all over the place, many of which are not mutually compatible. And so some people think they were used as toys, some people think they were worshipped, some people think they were used as essentially not very good pornography. And so if we could tell who made them, it would help. So it helps to know where they come from and what kinds of things they were found with. But we're hoping that we can combine the information about who made them with where they were found and maybe use that to help figure them out. Most recently, last summer, I was working at the site of ancient Corinth. So we know from text, we know something about archaic and classical period Greek sculptors. So people working from, say, 700 to 480. Well, if we're talking classical period, into, say, 330 BC. And all of the people we know about from text are men, and all of them we know about from text are working with marble or bronze and not with clay. But we have lots of clay sculpture. Ancient Corinth has quite a lot of it especially. They have beautiful clay. So they use it to make really nice pottery, but also to make ceramic sculpture. And so I think the base assumption that most people make is that all ancient sculptors were men. And so we're testing that hypothesis. Last summer, I scanned fingerprints from the interiors of, I think, 55 ceramic sculptors who were working on producing sculpture for a sanctuary site at ancient Corinth. And so far, the fingerprints look a lot more variable than I would have expected if they were all made by men. So we haven't crunched the numbers yet, but we will see.
So there may have been some women doing some sculpting.
There may have been some women doing some sculpting.
Well, let's face it, women had a great deal to do I know with literature, poetry in antiquity. So that there's no reason why they would not pick up a chisel and do some sculpting.
Well, I don't know about chisels yet.
Well,
because ceramics, my grandmother was actually a ceramic sculptress.
Oh, okay.
I guess sculptor is now the term one uses. So yes, I actually have 3 heads. My grandmother made a ceramic head for me, and so did my Aunt Mel. So yes, so when you make ceramic sculpture, you use your hands to model the clay. And so the ceramic sculptures that I'm working on, some parts of them are mold made, but most of them were handmade. And so today, an awful lot of Greek ceramics workshops are family affairs. So you might have a husband and wife team working together. And I think it's not impossible that the same was true in antiquity.
Okay. Now, what do you plan to do in the future in continuing this process?
Well, I actually have publication rights to pretty much everything from ancient Corinth that's ever been published, to the fingerprints on it. And that's a vast amount of material.
Oh, good heavens.
But I also have publication rights to a couple of sets of linear B tablets. So the first written Greek we have dates to the late Bronze Age, so maybe 1400 to 1200 BC. So very, very early, much earlier than Homer or any of the other authors you've heard of. And so these are on clay tablets, and they weren't intended to be fired. But when buildings burn down, if they have clay tablets inside, then they're accidentally fired. And quite a lot of them have fingerprints on them.
That's true. I never really thought about that. Unfortunately, that didn't help Alexandria, did it?
No.
In terms of the library, but
no. Well, it wasn't written on clay.
That's true. It was on papyrus, but well.
And actually, even in the Bronze Age in Greece, we may have lost things that were written on perishable materials. So the clay was probably the more temporary medium.
Just sort of as a philosophic observation, when do you think people decided that they wanted to write something for posterity rather than just for next week?
Well, so the linear B tablets we have are supposed to be apparently annual. A lot of them refer to next year or last year, but they're really just records. It's almost as if every other bit of our culture disappeared and we had the IRS records, right? They're not fascinating beach reading, but they're super informative. And so I think the first evidence we have for somebody who's writing with some intention that it's for posterity is probably Homer, and that's probably 8th century BC. So earlier than the ceramic sculptures and later than the linear B tablets.
Okay. Yeah, I really want to thank you for coming in here to talk about this. Do you plan to go out and do any, what we would view, I guess, as conventional archaeological work, in other words, digs?
No. I love digging, but I have a feeling that this project is pretty much going to take me the rest of my life.
Well, it sounds like it, given what you're tackling, it sounds like it's going to go beyond your life.
I hope so. I hope so. I have a couple of PhD candidates who have been sort of begging me to publish the methodology as quickly as possible because they want to use it also.
Now that is what you're currently involved in, isn't it? The methodology
right
for
now,
actually doing this.
Yes. Yes, so I'm both scanning ancient prints so that I've got them to apply the methodology to as soon as the methodology is ready to go. But in terms of building the methodology, we have prints now from about 90 adult Greek potters, both male and female, and we've started collecting prints from children. That's a little complicated because the EU has much stronger privacy laws than the US does. But we have worked with attorneys and we've got permission slips, and so now we're starting to collect prints from kids.
Well, I hope you don't have to get too involved with the legalities side of it.
We try to avoid that.
Well, again, Julie, I want to thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
It's been lovely to speak with you too.
Good luck in the future.
Thanks very much.
And that'll be a wrap for now, and we'll see you sometime in the near future.